Welcome to part 3 of the very basics of U.S. political institutions. When we last left, it was 40 minutes, so it's kind of longer than I thought it was going to be, but there was a lot to cover, right? We talked about the form of a just state, went through some of the history on the continent, talked about the importance of that Declaration of Independence, and then that leaves us with the question, which structures promote freedom and order? And that's where I want us thinking about how the Constitution actually works to promote freedom and order. But it takes us a while before we settle on the Constitution. We're going to have to go through a revolution and then a rather fractious period of the Articles of Confederation. All right, we were last at this strange moment when the founders realized that they needed to reject the ancient regime, the traditional hierarchical structure of government, and embrace what was clearly more of a Protestant pro-text reading of the relationship between the individual and their natural rights. That government, as opposed to being the guarantor of our access to natural rights, government had gotten to become the obstacle. So we're holding these truths to be self-evident. And that's an argument on behalf of minimizing the ancient regime, traditional structures of government. But we're left hanging with, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, how in the world is that actually going to operate? We were left with that interesting idea of a possibility of needing a foundation myth. Can we really even make it as a country without a foundation myth? Our foundation myth is built around the idea of rugged individualism. A couple of dynamics to this, right? One is that success in life is determined by forces that we can control. So the survey question that you see in front of you looks at the opposite. So people who are disagreeing with the statement that success is determined by forces outside of our control. This is a 2019 Pew Global Attitude Survey. Now, these kinds of findings are consistent across lots of surveys. We are talking about American exceptionalism. One dimension of American exceptionalism is that we think success in life is something that we can control. And if you go back to this previous slide, what's more important? That nobody is in need, or the freedom to pursue life's goals? So, old Europe, even they had their republican revolutions of different sorts and order and timing, still maintained many of the vestiges of a hierarchical, centrally located system. Yet in the new United States of America, highly decentralized in its structure, rejecting of the ancient regime, it was harder to maintain the vestiges of that hierarchy, and we see it still today, right? Look at old Europe compared to us. What's more important? Why, of course, it's the freedom to pursue life's goals. And if we fail in life, if we don't reach those goals, who are we going to blame? Other people? Now, part of our foundation myth, this idea of rugged individualism, is that we take it on ourselves. Success in life is determined by forces that we can control. Now, I mentioned last time that the idea of a foundation myth is central to all of the foundations of civilization, the cradles of civilization, that Plato and all the philosophers tell us they're very, very important. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. We believe that our foundation myth may not necessarily be true, but we believe, we're almost taught to believe, that when you're born in this country, you ought to be able to shake yourselves loose of any things that are going to keep you down, and you're going to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Because in reality, we're not born as rugged individuals. We're born as infants within a family system that takes many years to nurture us, to prepare us to survive in the world. We are born without boots, much less bootstraps. But even as adults, some people don't have the boots. Who's to blame? The individual or the state? Well, part of our foundation myth, rugged individualism, is that we're going to be able to make it on our way, no matter what. Unlike most of the rest of the world, we have a very clear distinction here between our government and our country. This gentleman is wearing a t-shirt that I actually own. I bought this t-shirt in the great state of Maine, a state full of maniacs where they believe in limited government. I love my country, it's the government I hate. Many systems don't have that distinction between the government and the country, but we very much do. What does it mean to be the country, the United States of America? What values do we hold dear? Certainly a belief in individual opportunity, in being left alone to make money, to make our families better off. 1776, a remarkable year when you remember, of course, the Declaration of Independence was written, and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the foundational document of capitalism, also written, published in 1776. And the history of our form of democratic capitalistic competitiveness and the economic competitiveness in capitalism both grew up together. So we have this interesting foundation myth. Rugged individualism. You can make it, and that's not wrong. It's deeply embedded, though. And when you put it against our, by design, distrust of government, this is a heck of a hard country to govern. It was designed for a very, very different time, a very different kind of global economy. One of the remarkable things about this democratic system is that it has survived this long, partly because government hasn't gotten so strong that they've been able to squash many of our fundamental rights and liberties. But remember, there are no checks and balances. It's a constant conflict, a constant struggle. You can get the same sentiment in a hat. I could get that sentiment on a mug. We're surrounded by this idea. Now, how, if this is what we're facing, how are we going to actually get anything done? One of the fascinating realities when you look at comparative data, United States versus other countries, is that if you look at the percentage of the gross domestic product that goes into taxation or user fees across all levels of government, the United States government appears to be relatively small. I have a link in here. You'll be able to go on, of course, and download the PDF versions of these lectures and take a look at the slides and go through any of these links. This link will take you to a fabulous site. It's the Heritage Foundation site. And they update it every year, giving a sense for the burden of government and the economy. And so what you see here is a bit of a snapshot of some of these countries. It gives us the percentage of the gross domestic product that goes towards government, the tax burden, at all levels of government. So it's user fees, it's a value-added tax, it's the gas tax, it's your income tax. They add it up across all, and Heritage is always wanting to make sure they find every penny that's being taxed, whether you call it a tax or a fee. Great data set. What this data happens not to show you is how much we're borrowing on an annual basis, which is also an important part of the story. But let's stick right here and notice the difference between those old European centrally located governments and where we are. So among the top 10 states, at least on the list that I've maintained here, you've got France and Denmark and Belgium and Sweden and Finland. In France, almost half of their entire economy, their gross domestic product, is captured by the government in the form of taxation. Half! That's unbelievable. It's almost impossible for us to imagine in the United States. So there's the top 10, followed by another interesting set. Many European countries, of course, here, Luxembourg, Norway, Germany. You go further down the list, it's a long way down. Moldova's higher than us, Estonia. Where is the United States? What do our relevant competitors look like in terms of the size of government when measured as percentage of gross domestic product paid in taxes. Well, we're there with Bulgaria. Jamaica's a little ahead of us. South Korea a little bit below us. 27% of our gross domestic product in 2020, this was the estimate from the end of 2019 from Heritage, but 27% of the entire economy is captured by government. Sounds like a lot until you look at the other countries. Would you trade our system for most of these other systems? Well, probably not. Bulgaria, you pay more in taxes. Do you get different kinds of outcomes? And remember, the United States is subsidizing the cost of the defense of a country like South Korea, which is roughly taxed at the same level that we are. How is this even possible? Well, I don't want you taking away from this little chat that when you run for office, that you can go around telling people, hey, you know what? Relative to our other nations, we're undertaxed. I tell you, it certainly doesn't feel that way to most of us. But at least comparatively, we are part of a smaller government in the United States than most of the rest of the world, and certainly all of the top 50 nations in terms of outcomes, we are by far the least taxed. How is that even possible? Part of it is because we're a system that was set up expecting that you can't trust government, so you better find some other way to get something done. How does that work in the United States? It's a heck of a problem. Our ancient tradition, the ancient regime, the hierarchical system of government that we've rejected, and part of that is seen in the relatively small amount of money that goes towards government. Again, this is all levels of government. How in the world do you even make anything operate in this particular system? How do we survive? Let's look at the three sectors of the economy first. The public sector, kind of obvious, right? That's what we're looking at on this particular slide. A percentage of gross domestic product. This doesn't include debt, but in terms of direct taxation and fees, the public sector. You know how that works, right? You have government bureaucracy at lots of different levels, and they do things, and they provide clean water, and we have a national defense, and they provide a road system. And the public sector is a massive part of our GDP, not as large as our competitors, but it's a big part. And then, of course, the private sector, where most of us are working. Not me, I'm in the nonprofit sector. We'll get to that in a moment. But remember 1776, right? The Declaration of Independence, same year you get Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the foundational ideas there in capitalism. In the private sector, you have owners of companies who make a profit and then take the money, the excess rents, and they can spend it however they choose. It's a huge engine of economic growth. It's the process of so-called creative destruction with high degrees of capitalistic competition. One would expect, certainly hope, that you'll get more efficient services and goods, better goods. In the mythical pin factory of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you need no government bureaucracy telling you how many pins to create. It's the laws of supply and demand, right? The hidden hand of the marketplace will make some pin factories successful and others less. The hidden hand of competition is going to be an important idea when we think about competition in a democracy. So these are the two biggest parts of our economy. The private sector by far the largest, the public sector quite important, quite large. And then you have something in between, the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector is a tough thing to describe. We don't have good comparative data on the nonprofit sector, primarily because the nonprofit sector is allowed to exist. It's defined by the tax code. It's neither the public sector nor directly the private sector. It is something in between. Now, in the private sector, the idea is to get a profit and then reward the shareholders of a private company. And that process of seeking profits, leads to better products through competition, in theory, okay, that makes some sense, right? In the public sector, we know you're elected to try and do things, and we're taxed to kind of provide goods and services. The nonprofit sector, though, where that is somehow a kind of an interesting mix of the two, because it's made possible by the tax code. The government decides which groups can be in the nonprofit sector. If one is in the nonprofit sector, like the private sector, you can go out there and try and make a profit, but the profits all get shuttled back into the mission. So a nonprofit sector group needs to be mission-oriented, serving the broader public, not giving shareholders the money. Again, it's defined by the government, so it's hard to compare us to other parts of the world. Now, some will call these NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Some places in Europe call it civil society, and it kind of captures what we're talking about. But these are organizations that exist and turn their so-called profits back towards the mission. The American Red Cross, the Heart Association, Salvation Army, United Way. You understand, we all give to these. Well, I hope you do, but it's much larger than this. It includes our churches, our religious institutions, our non-profits. This is why churches, for example, don't pay local property taxes, because you can tax a for-profit organization, but not a non-profit in the same way. There are different rules and regulations about what you can do with religious organizations and what qualifies as a religious organization at all. Is this something that's deemed by God? No, it comes through the tax code. You'll notice around the rest of the world that the relationship between governments and their churches are indeed very, very different. In this capitalistic competition for souls, especially within the Protestant community, you compete for members and create a niche, a religious niche, without governmental control. Beyond churches, beyond these like big things like Salvation Army, our hospitals are nonprofits. Hospitals. This befuddles people in other countries. What do you mean your hospitals are nonprofits? You mean the government doesn't run them? No, the government helps pay for a lot of what happens in the hospitals, but it is nonprofit with their excess rents allegedly going towards the mission. Our universities are nonprofits. Now, there are some state universities, of course, but a place like Harvard University, of course, we get plenty of money from the government, and that'll come, to do scientific research about something, or for financial aid for certain students. But in the tax code, like most universities, we are a nonprofit. Now, I think if I look around Harvard, I say, well, it looks to me like Harvard's a hedge fund with some classrooms attached. But we are a nonprofit. Nonprofits are everywhere. Who takes care of the homeless in this country? Nonprofits. Through an organization like in Massachusetts, the Pine Street Inn. So when we think about where we are relative to the rest of the world on that chart of the percentage of our GDP that goes into government taxation, what we have going for us is a huge amount of the work that's done in the government sector elsewhere is done in our nonprofit sector. So the nonprofit sector is large and incredibly important and difficult to govern. When you think about your future careers, I want you to be able to imagine operating in each of these sectors sometime over your career. Spend time in, have the tools and techniques of working in the public sector. Understand how dynamic and innovative things can be in the private sector. And then work for a mission in a nonprofit sector environment. This is a very almost cartoonish view. It gets much more complicated, but this is, again, the very basics of U.S. political institutions. I've just noticed that far too often people talk about the public sector and forget that the nonprofit sector is a huge part of how we solve public problems in this country. When we are by far a country that gives, a people who give to nonprofits. As a percentage of the gross domestic product, we have the largest nonprofit sector of any Western democracy. And many of our international nonprofits are based here. We are a nation of joiners, and the nonprofit sector does a huge amount of our work. Okay, so one of the solutions to the problem of how do you govern when you set up a system that's designed to have minimal government because you can't trust government, one of the answers is that you're going to work with this new thing, the nonprofit sector, the economy. You're also going to have partnerships with the private sector of the economy and try and get some of the work done through that sector as well. Because that's part of our answer. We can't ever, I think, unwash ourselves of the blood from the revolution. And that is a strong statement against centralized government and a fundamental distrust of government. It's almost, as we think about our own past, almost a deification of the foundational ideas of the government. Whatever hat you're wearing, Democrat or Republican, liberal, conservative, we are all embedded in a system built out of this expectation that government shouldn't get too darn big and government can't be trusted completely. All right, how do we promote freedom and order in this system with this reality, right? Government's going to be relatively small. That's what we're going to aim for. We don't know what kind of government we're going to want. All we know is we don't want King George III. And so if we're not going to have King George III, what are our options? Well, if King George III is one extreme, tyranny of one, what's the other extreme? The other extreme is tyranny of all, and the founders called that democracy. The founders were afraid of democracy. It was conceived of as mob rule, and you don't want democracy. Now, you and I talk about democracy as if that's the same thing that the founders believed in. It certainly isn't. Tyranny of one, King George III. Tyranny of all, democracy. Mob rule. What do we have instead? A representative republic. A republican form of government in which people are elected to positions of leadership to represent the crowd. When we pledge allegiance to the flag, pay attention to the words. It's very important, right? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. We do not pledge allegiance to a democracy. We pledge allegiance to a flag that represents a republic. What in the world do we mean by a republic, and how did this idea get put on us? Again, you have to think about it in the context of our revolution against the British Crown. We knew we needed to replace them. What you have in front of you here is a wonderful etching, an etching was produced by Paul Revere. He didn't actually create the picture, but he produces this picture of the Boston Massacre. And notice it's a clever piece of propaganda. A clever piece of propaganda because in reality the redcoats were in retreat. They were being attacked by a mob, and one of the soldiers who was hit by an ice ball turned around and his rifle fired, or his musket fired. But this is the basic idea that, this tyrannical British Crown is firing on the people, and our revolution begins. The Revolutionary Wars, usually thought of, right, in U.S. history books is like this thing that happens, but I want you thinking about it in 3 stages, and I want you especially paying attention to that map we showed earlier of the cultural traditions, the history and background in the country. You'll remember that the settlers in Virginia were the bitter opponents of the Puritans up in New England. They came from different sides of the British Civil War. That the buffer zone between, which was opened up thanks to the Quakers, was populated by Germans and was the transit route for the Scots and the Irish. And that you had slaves operating in all of the colonies and all the way into present-day Canada. So that's the world that you're operating in. And the British government is also at war with, that moment, not a hot war, but in a long-term engaged way, in conflict with the French. That'll prove to be important. The Revolutionary War came out of the context of the closure of the French and Indian War and the settlement of the westward expansion lines at the Allegheny Mountains. So taxes were increased. The Revolutionary War begins, but not all at once. The first phases of the war take place before the Declaration of Independence is written. And they take place largely in New England and in what is now Canada and upstate New York. I want you to, well, I need you to try and imagine how unpopulated much of the region was. And to imagine yourself in New England, overwhelmingly Protestant, unhappy with the way that the French and Indian War had been decided, unhappy with the increase in taxes, and the British are trying to enforce their taxes. When the war breaks out, the people who fought on the side of the colonists were farmers, and they had their own weapons. And the early farmers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire that were fighting early in the war ended up fighting for years. Some would go back and try and plant crops, but the bulk of the army is coming from New England and then the mid-Atlantic states later. So the first wave of this begins before the Declaration of Independence. There's important battle over territorial expansion that could happen up towards Canada. And within Boston, you have, of course, first the Boston Tea Party, etc., and then the March in Lexington and Concord. The British occupied Boston, and they end up surrendering Boston or evacuating Boston in March of 1776. So this is the first big phase of the war. The New Continental Army is running. It looks like the war is largely going to be just kind of contained to New England. But it expands, and after the Declaration of Independence, you have the bulk of the activity taking place around Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then an extremely important battle that happens up near Saratoga Springs. But in this second phase of the war, where Pennsylvania plays such a crucial role, this is where you'll remember the sort of story of Valley Forge and George Washington leading troops across the Delaware and taking Trenton, New Jersey, and so forth. But pay attention to who's actually doing the fighting during this period. In Pennsylvania, a majority of the citizens are German Americans fighting for revolution, for independence, in places like Germantown or Brandywine. And one of the most important battles, that Battle of Trenton, you have German Americans overwhelming Hessian mercenaries because the British had hired Hessian mercenaries from Germany. It's interesting. It feels almost, looking back at it, almost miraculous that we survived this period of the war, that George Washington was incredibly good at fighting a rear guard action. He was great at withdrawing just in time to live and fight another day. The British still anticipated that this conflict would be decided in their favor. They clearly have military superiority, and they have economic superiority, and they have their friends in the southern colonies. And that's where the action really has its final moments. Because in the third phase of the war, you have two very important surprise guests. The first are the French who had been convinced to enter into this war, largely after some of those surprising successes in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. And they entered by agreeing to block ports. It was a little dangerous for the French to decide that they were going to do this. This is, of course, before the French Revolution. The last thing they want to be seen is supporting the idea of revolution. But the French know that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the British enemy were the French. So the French blockade the ports in the south, and then coming out of the hills in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, you have the Scots-Irish. They'd been largely off of the political map, but what they wanted to do was defeat the British. You know, the influx of remarkable patriots of Scotch-Irish ancestry entering the war in this third critical phase, and with the leadership largely of farmers and soldiers from New England, and with the French blockading the ports, the British have to withdraw, surrender, and the war is won. Now, the British thought that this was still going to be a kind of a temporary thing. They'd be able to get them back into the fold. It didn't work out as they had expected to in the South. But without the Scotch-Irish, without the French, we don't win this war. Without George Washington and kind of the theatrics and small miracles in the mid-Atlantic, we don't win the war. And without this long-term commitment of the New England farmers, who gave up several years of growing crops, we don't win this war. But what do you do now? What do you replace it with? If our desire is to have a form of government that's built out of the consent of the governed, how are you going to handle that? Now, each of these colonies that now become independent states, free and independent states, they were on their own, right? Highly decentralized, spread out all over, very different cultural traditions. How do you take that and create a new system of government? Well, they didn't do it in one quick pass, because the first thing they did was to create something called the Confederation among the states, right? Articles of Confederation. And Articles of Confederation are absolutely fascinating. I encourage you to go take a look at the background readings here. Again, find it on the website. You can download the PDF files, take a look at all of the links, and read about this incredible period of the Articles of Confederation. Because more than anything, what they're telling us in the Articles of Confederation is what they don't want. We don't want something like a strong centralized state. Article 2, each state retains its sovereignty and freedom and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right. Among these Articles of Confederation, there's no national army. Instead, each state is encouraged to have a well-regulated militia. That's a phrase you're going to hear again in the Constitution. But a well-regulated militia is something that is controlled by the state. And people in communities were forced to be part of that militia and had to have weapons ready to defend their states. There's no national army to speak of. There's the nascent quality of a national navy, not very effective early on. Instead, with these state-regulated militias, if you're under attack, you can ask another state to come and help you out, but there's no obligation of mutual defense. There's also no national currency. Each state could create its own currency. Often it was tied to Spanish silver, but each state could handle it however they wanted. And as a result, if you had Rhode Island currency, it didn't have to be accepted in Connecticut. Well, that's kind of crazy. How do you run a national economy when Rhode Island and Connecticut can't use the same currency? And although the Articles of Confederation said, there are going to be no ambassadors who are going to go out and speak on behalf of the entire country, there were states that sent ambassadors to other countries. And worst of all, with the British trade stopping after the Revolutionary War, we spun into a terrible depression, economic depression. And it was fairly clear after a few years that the Articles of Confederation needed to be reformed. It's a great moment in something called Shays' Rebellion, which takes place here in Western Massachusetts. Daniel Shays and other heroes of the Revolutionary War wanted to be paid. They'd been promised they were going to be paid. These were the farmers who spent a couple of years in the military, and they weren't paid. And there was no real national currency. So they decided they're going to march on the capital, Boston, and demand from the governor that they be paid what they were told they would be receiving. And along the way, they armed themselves. And they took over a courthouse and an armory. And they start marching towards Boston. And now is the time when the governor of Massachusetts calls out to the other states and says, my goodness, if there's ever been a time when we ought to invoke the Article of Confederation about mutual aid, military assistance, it's now. Come help me. We have to put this down. And the other states sort of looked at their pocket watch and powdered their wigs and said, it's not a particularly good time for us. And this is when Thomas Jefferson, who's in Paris, decides to say, the tree of liberty needs to be watered with blood every now and then, right? The Articles of Confederation clearly failing. They're in an economic depression. So the states decided we're going to amend, we're going to change, we're going to fix the Articles of Confederation. And they gathered together in Pennsylvania and they ended up writing a new constitution. The Constitution, which is fascinating. We're going to have to take a good close look at some of it. The Constitution, of course, has Article 1, Legislative Branch, Article 2, Executive Branch, Article 3, the Judicial Branch. It creates a system of government where there's a House and a Senate. The House of Representatives is supposed to be proportional representation, according to Madison. And the population of a state would be reflected in the House of Representatives. And in the Grand Compromise that came out of an offering from New Jersey, the Senate would not represent people, but the Senate would represent states. So each state would receive 2 senators. This fascinating new system. Now, when they wrote the Constitution, they were worried about word getting out that they might actually ditch the Articles of Confederation. It was important that nobody know exactly what's happening. So in the summer, they closed the windows at Carpenter Hall and didn't let anybody in. They asked that notes not be taken, no contemporaneous records be kept. that deliberations be secret, and they wrote a new constitution. What would have happened if you'd had transparency and everybody could watch as this constitution is written? It would have been picked apart and never done. Sometimes sunshine is a great disinfectant. Sometimes sunshine will kill a flower before it really takes root. Well, the Constitution is then offered up, and two battle lines are drawn around the actual acceptance or ratification of the Constitution. You need 9 states to ratify. It didn't take unanimity. The Articles of Confederation required unanimity for all kinds of things, but they said, you know what? This is the Constitution. We're just gonna ask for 9. So the race is on to try and get those 9 states to ratify the Constitution. The battle lines are drawn between 2 factions, the Federalists on one. And the Federalists argued that we really need to have a strong centralized government. Now, the Federalists were writing op-eds in newspapers, and those op-eds are usually written under a tight time deadline, and the structure of their op-eds were almost always the same. There's a problem out there that's sort of sewn into the fabric of who we are as human beings, right? Who are we? We tend to be greedy. We tend to like avarice and ambition. We tend to create factions, create groups that have interests that compete with other groups. And the solution to those kinds of natural elements in mankind is going to be, oh my goodness, it's exactly what we wrote in the Constitution. Therefore, come and ratify it. So, the authors of the Federalist Paper, who were 3 founding fathers, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, wrote under a pseudonym, and they published these papers in order to try and get delegates to vote in favor of ratifying the Constitution. On the other side were a group, unfortunately just left alone as the anti-federalists, who argued that this new Constitution gave way too much power to the central government. And where are the protections of the individual rights and freedoms? So they battle it out in the newspapers, but more importantly, they battle it out within their state delegations in their hopes to try and ratify it. And it becomes quite clear that it will not get ratified. A state like Massachusetts, for example, said, oh yeah, we'll take the Constitution, however, contingent upon the passage of a Bill of Rights. And it was at that moment that the tide turns. And it becomes crystal clear that the only way you're going to get ratification of the Constitution is if you include an agreement that we will pass a Bill of Rights. So the Constitution, as we conceive of it, really is an agreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. What I'm showing you now is just a vote on the committee report, which is basically in favor of the Constitution. All in favor of the Constitution? This is August 2nd, 1788. Overwhelmingly in North Carolina, they say no. Why aren't they going to vote in favor of the Constitution? Because too much power is going to go to central government. Okay, so once you solve that problem and you get the clear agreement that, okay, we will ratify the Constitution, but we're also going to have a Bill of Rights, then you get ratification. So, we shouldn't just think of the Constitution as Article 1, 2, 3, etc. You have to think about it as the entire package, this agreement. You don't get the Constitution until you get the agreement that there will be a Bill of Rights. So when we think about our Constitution, you need to begin, of course, with the preamble, and it ends with the 10th Amendment. Even then, ratification was a fairly close call. This map shows you the final votes on ratification by states. And the green areas here on the maps are areas of the states that voted against ratifying the Constitution. Already you see a big difference between Long Island and Manhattan, vice upstate New York. They didn't trust central government. Look at Western Pennsylvania, where some of the Scots-Irish were. They voted against the Constitution. How do you end up ratifying this thing? Well, in a few key states, they had some requirements. What's your address look like? Do you have a stone house? Or are you moving state by state? Hey, how long have you been in these back hills of Georgia? We ratified the Constitution largely by limiting the voice and input from the Scotch-Irish, who were deeply suspicious of central government. In other words, some of our foundational documents depend on picking and choosing which voices you're going to listen to. This grand compromise, the Constitution, was a compromise built on the backs of many. A compromise that really only adhered to white men who owned property, not to women, no vote. Not to slaves, no vote. Not to Native Americans, who are not even considered people. They don't count in a census. They are, for all intents and purposes, non-human. What kind of divine compromise treats blacks as 3/4 of a human being only for the purposes of a census, and treats African Americans as non-humans, that denies the right to vote to people who are women and who don't have property? It was a compromise that ultimately gets ratified by not listening to the Scots-Irish voices either. It's a heck of a tricky way to try and create a central government. The final sentence of our Constitution, which depends upon the Bill of Rights, is the 10th Amendment. So you begin with the fancy words in the Declaration of Independence. And then you have the preamble to the Constitution. And it all ends with the 10th Amendment, which is a powerful one and haunts us today. Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, if we didn't tell you you can do something, and our states aren't prohibited from doing it, the states get to do it. It's a fairly unambiguous statement. Well, we'll see about that. We're left with this strange system. Which structures promote freedom and order? Well, let's have a bicameral institution, a House and a Senate. Let's try and divide up the executive branch from the legislative branch. How's that going to promote freedom and order? Trust us, it won't be as bad as the Articles of Confederation were. Huge amount of the power is left to the states in the 10th Amendment. And that's where we're going to turn next. Because until we figure out how to think about federalism, we are not going to get anything done. And so that's where we turn next.